We've heard the stories in the news, right? Former Chief of Defense Staff General Jonathan Vance is facing allegations of harassment and inappropriate behavior with two female subordinates. Now, we know that Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan will be talking about this or testifying about this in Ottawa today. And these allegations are just the latest in recent reports of misconduct and sexual harassment within the Canadian Armed Forces. Here's the real kicker here with this story, though. It's also been revealed that the government was aware of allegations against General Vance back in 2018, but it sounds like they failed to investigate the claims or something happened there, but that it wasn't looked into 3 years ago. Now, that raises a question for a lot of employers out there. What is your obligation the moment you hear about a potential problem of harassment or some kind of allegation? What is your obligation at that point moving forward? We thought we'd go to the experts on this, right? Aliya Virani joins us now, an associate at Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. Aliya, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Simi. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Are you getting a lot of questions about this recently?
Oh, not just recently. This is unfortunately something that comes up. I mean, I can think in my past week, there's at least two people that, spoke to me about concerns about sexual harassment in their workplace. So it's not limited to, say, these big stories that we hear about in the news. It is something that I think the average Canadian still faces in the workplace. So it's important that this information, I think, is out there, both for employers and for employees.
Okay, so let's start from the employer perspective on this then.
Mm-hmm.
If you hear about this, let's say you're a manager and you hear about this, maybe not an official complaint, right? But someone says to you, there's a problem over there with so-and-so doing so-and-so. What is your obligation at that point?
Exactly. So, okay, this is what employers should do. As a starting point, they need to know that they have an obligation to maintain a workplace that is safe and free from harassment and bullying. Now, sexual harassment is one of the more extreme cases of harassment. They need to have no tolerance for that type of complaint, and they have an obligation to investigate. So that's step one. They need to investigate every complaint, take every complaint seriously, figure out who said what, and then eventually make a decision with respect to whatever findings they have. Now, the law requires that this investigation be impartial and competent, and in most cases it's recommended, I think also with the case with General Vance, that there be an outside or independent investigator to do that. A lot of people specialize in this, and they do this as a job. It's not required that this be, say, an outside person, but it can certainly help. For example, if you have a complaint against your manager, you can't have that manager investigating, or even that manager's manager, because there could be seen to have some bias.
So I guess the important thing here is just because you hear it in a casual conversation and it's not an official report, doesn't let anybody off the hook.
No, it doesn't. And so if there's any sort of question that this may be going on, the employer has to take that very, very seriously and really do their due diligence with every type of comment that's made. Of course, if you're the employee that's experiencing the harassment, the best step would be to file a complaint to ensure that the employer is aware about it. You need to give them an opportunity to remedy the situation.
Okay, now let's say you're the person who is unfortunately subject to this harassment, Aliya. So do you have to make an official complaint, or can you tell somebody and think that that's enough?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways you go about this. I think that if it depends on the situation. If you are unfortunately at one of those smaller companies and your employer does not have the procedure to deal with this complaint adequately, maybe you want to seek outside counsel from the get-go. But if you do have the proper channel in the company, you have to kind of give them that opportunity to remedy things. And it would be best for you to make a formal complaint, have them go through the investigation process. A lot of times you can still work while your employer is investigating the situation. Maybe just be separate from the person that's involved in the dispute. Maybe there's options for them to be suspended with pay, so you can at least give your company an opportunity to kind of figure things out. But if that process is not working, then you have other options. I mean, employees in BC can make a WorkSafe BC complaint. WorkSafe will investigate if the employer has the proper policy and procedure with respect to bullying and harassment. If that's not working, they've got remedies under the WorkSafe regime. They can make a claim for mental distress injuries, protection against retaliation. Otherwise, if they hire private counsel, there's a couple of different options that they can go to from there.
Right. It just sounds like you really have to protect yourself in these cases.
You do. You kind of, I mean, it's unfortunate because you have to, it would be best if you can act a little bit as your own advocate. Of course, it's very difficult.
So hard, yeah.
That's the problem, is that sometimes you just don't, it's all you can do to endure the situation. But, I mean, you do have options, and certainly counsel are well suited to be your advocate when you feel like that's not a possibility and you just don't have maybe the emotional resources to deal with that yourself. For example, counsel could make you have the option to make a complaint under the human rights legislation in your province, because that would be discrimination based on sex. A human rights tribunal would review the actions of the company, assess whether they've violated those rights. There is an option for protection against retaliation, or, you have a right to be free from reprisal. You can make, say, a constructive dismissal complaint on the basis that the employers effectively, ended your employment relationship by virtue of their actions. And of course, you can have a counsel kind of guide you through those processes to get the remedies that are available to you if you just feel like you're not able to deal with that yourself.
But are there any consequences, Aliya, if an employer doesn't properly investigate or doesn't do things the way you have spelled out?
Yes, exactly. So if that happens, then certainly if somebody's hired counsel, then, or they proceed with one of those claims, then that would be, very condemning evidence that the employer is responsible or has not met their obligations. And when that happens, there are things called damages, which is just a fancy way of saying compensation or money that, the employer has to pay to the person that they've harmed, or that they've harmed by virtue of not following those obligations that they're required to. Not only that, but say, for example, the employee brought a claim under human rights legislation, they may be required to have, sensitivity training. They could have to issue a formal apology. They have to, there's procedural steps that they have to be in line with, certainly under WorkSafe BC rules as well. So, there's real consequences for employers who don't do this.
So when you hear about this happening at the federal government level, does that surprise you, or do you think, man, it happens in every workplace?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think the big problem here, and what would certainly help when we hear about cases of harassment in the government, is having some sort of impartial or independent body that can really look into things, because I think that the culture, if we expect it to change by itself, is going to be a very long process. And maybe in the meantime, we can do everything we can to kind of have those procedural protections for people while we catch up, with maybe the way that we behave to each other.
So every time a story like this is in the news, Aliya, do you start to get more phone calls and questions and people wanting to talk about harassment?
Well, the funny thing about this is anytime there's a very highly, visible or publicized story, I think people are more aware of what that could look like, what sexual harassment could look like. Maybe they feel like as long as it's a relationship that's somewhat consensual, it's all right. And then somebody may learn, oh, no, you know what, if it's subordinate and a superior, maybe there's elements of power and control here. And anything that, kind of makes these situations more visible to the general public can empower people to pursue their rights if they're not aware of what may constitute sexual harassment, for example. So, any efforts by the news to get this out there is always helpful, and, just encouraging people to pursue their protections.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for the advice this morning.